study computer science. Please join me in welcoming Ava Cruz on Animals Behind Bars and its captive breeding version.
Imagine you in a world without animals. Imagine you in a world without animals. When you look out your window, there are no birds in the sky and no squirrels running around your yard. In your house, there isn't a dog staring at the window ready to bark at anything that walks by. And there isn't a cat curled up asleep in the sunlight. When it's time to eat, you open your fridge to find that there's no chicken or beef or cheese or butter or eggs. This is what life would look like without animals. This is what tomorrow could look like if we do nothing today. One way to prevent this from happening is by using captive breeding. The first known use of captive breeding was in the 1960s. The Phoenix Zoo had the first successful breeding program with the Arabian oryx. In the wild, the Arabian oryx had gone extinct, but there were still a few in captivity, and the zoos that had them didn't want them to go extinct, so they tried captive breeding. The zoo started with 9 animals and ended with over 200. The Arabian oryxes were released into the wild in 1982, and today there are over 1,000 in the wild. After the breeding program of the Arabian oryx proved that it worked, scientists and zoos wanted to try with other species that were also going extinct. The most expensive captive breeding program was that of the California condor. The breeding program started in 1987 and has cost $35 million. At the start of the program, the scientists captured the last 22 California condors that were living in the wild. Their breeding program was successful because today there are over 520 California condors in the wild. A few other successful breeding programs include that of the black-footed ferret, the golden-lined tamarin, and the red wolf. Without captive breeding, all of these animals and many more would have become extinct. Today, there are almost 17,000 animals that are threatened. Between 2010 and 2019, over 160 animal species became extinct. If we do nothing, most threatened animals will go extinct, and more than 160 animals will go extinct in the next 10 years. Animal populations all over the world are declining, and if we do nothing to address this problem, more animals will be added to the ever-growing list of threatened species. Many species have gone extinct because captive breeding was not being used yet, the species did not do well in a captive breeding program, or the species was not part of a captive breeding program. Before I go further into this topic, I need to define a few terms. The first term is conservation, which means the management of a natural resource to prevent destruction or neglect. The second term is captivity, which means an animal that is confined to a particular space and prevented from leaving. The final term is a zoo, which is an establishment that maintains a collection of wild animals for study, conservation, or to display to the public. By the end of this speech, I hope that you will learn what captive breeding is, why captive breeding is important, the effects captive breeding has on an animal, and biblical reasons why humans need to care about animals in captive breeding. And most importantly, why animal conservation is necessary to combat the declining animal population. So then, what is captive breeding? According to an article from ScienceDirect.com, captive breeding can be defined as the act of bringing rare or endangered animals into captivity with the hope of rearing sustainable captive population for eventual reintroduction to the wild. In simpler terms, it means bringing an animal from the wild into captivity, breeding them so there's a large population in captivity, and then returning them to the wild. Once the animal is released into the wild, the hope is that the animals will thrive, a larger population will arise, and the species will no longer be endangered. Right now, you're probably thinking, why should I care about captive breeding and the animal population? Eric Sanders has a good answer to this question. He states that the primary reason people conserve animals is because it is in their interest to do so. Animal populations confer economic, cultural, aesthetic, spiritual, and ethical benefits on human society. Animals help economically by spreading seeds, by pollinating plants, and by being tourist attractions. There are many cultural practices that are centered around or involve animals, and in order for people to be able to continue these practices, there needs to be animals that they can use. Aesthetically, animals in large numbers become world-known spectacles, and people will travel all over the world to see them. Many people also want to connect with animals in a spiritual way, and having a large population lets people have a greater chance of being able to do so. Almost every religion says something about being a steward and caring for the natural world. Most people don't know the effects that animals have on their lives and the effects that they have on an animal's life. One of the worst effects that humans have on an animal's life is not doing anything to try and prevent extinction and not caring for them. Many people think that an animal that is living in captivity has a bad life, when in reality, that is not true. As stated in an article about bioscience, if animals were provided with the opportunities to display a range of species-appropriate behaviors and to make behavioral choices that give them some control over their lives, they can live a life that is the same as it would in the wild or possibly even better. When you go to a zoo and see animals playing with toys that they are given, this is just one way that animals can have this opportunity. Another way they do this is by making an animal's habitat as realistic as it would be in the wild. When an animal is given the ability to act like they do in the wild, they have a better chance of being part of a successful breeding program and have the opportunity to be released back into the wild. One of the biggest issues with captive breeding is being able to release an animal back into the wild. When an animal is kept in captivity, they often lose or never learn skills that they need to survive without human help or influence. Science Direct states that one way to keep this from happening is by reducing the amount of time species spend in captivity before reintroduction to the wild. By limiting the time that an animal doesn't have to rely on skills used for survival, the less likely they are to become totally dependent on human help and influence for survival, and the less likely bad genetic changes will happen. Genetic changes are another reason why it's very important and best for an animal to be released back into the wild as quickly as they can. Genetic changes mostly occur when there's a small gene pool and no new genes being added to that pool. In his article, Sanderson states that the relationship between population size and rate of genetic change is complicated by the relative balance between natural selection on one hand and genetic drift on the other. His point is that in a population of 100 cows and another of 10, there will be negative genetic change in both groups, but in the group with 100 cows, the change will less likely to be passed down. Say you have a field with two fields with cows. One has 100 cows in it, and the other only has 10. One cow from each group has a negative genetic change. You pick one cow from each field. The field with 100 cows, you only have a 1% chance to pick the bad cow, while the field with 10 cows, you have a 10% chance. In this example, you are 10 times as likely to pick the bad cow because there are less good cows to pick from. This idea is important because having a larger population means that there will be a smaller chance for detrimental genetic change. Some of these negative genetic changes can affect an animal's ability to reproduce, an animal's speed, an animal's sight, or the animal's overall health. No matter what the change is, negative change will not be good for the animal, and that is why the population of a species is very important. Finding the ideal population of a species is something that must be done with animals in captivity. When figuring out what the goal populations of a species should be, scientists have many factors that need to be considered. Some of these factors are time, money, the effects that captivity has on an animal, the space that is available for use. Setting the goal population is important because scientists, managers, policymakers need to make wise choices about natural resources and justify these choices to spectacle audience, especially giving competition for demands and the limited funds. Having a population goal lets zoos and the scientists they work with know the best way to spend that time, money, and resources. So then, what is the point in having a zoo? The point of a zoo is so that people can see and learn about animals that they normally never would. In my interview with Australia Zoo, they said that their motto and base for running a zoo is conservation through exciting education. Their idea is that if a person goes to the zoo, they see, learn about, and connect with animals that they wouldn't be able to do in the wild, they would want to save those animals. A better way to put this is a quote by Steve Earn, when he says, "People want to save the things they love." Through zoos, people also get the opportunity to see and interact with animals that they never would get to in the wild. Running a zoo is also very expensive, and without people coming to zoos, they would not have the funds to run it. On average, it costs at least $10,000 a day to run a zoo, and that doesn't include the cost for building, maintenance, upgrades, or expansions. Things like these can cost millions of dollars, which they wouldn't have without people paying for tickets to go to the zoo. Without people wanting to see wild animals and wanting to learn about them, zoos would not be able to run and people wouldn't want to be able to help save them. While all of these things that I've said before are important reasons why animal conservation matters, the main reason that we need to conserve animals and love them is because God created animals. In Genesis 2:19, it says, "The Lord God has formed out of the ground all the wild animals and all the birds in the sky." We're called to love all parts of God's creation, and animals are parts of God's creation, so we are called to love them. When humans were created, their first purpose was to care for animals. You can see this in the first chapter of Genesis. Verse 26 states that God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea, and the birds in the sky, over the livestock, and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." Well, we now have other purposes. Our first purpose was to care for animals, because that was what we were created to do. After animals and humans were created, we were told to care for them. Psalms 6-8 says that God made humans the rulers over flocks and herds, and all the animals of the wild, the birds in the sky, the fish in the sea, and all that swim the path of the sea. God created animals. God told us to care for the animals that he created. When people don't care for animals or think that they have no obligation to, they are going against God's words and commandments that he gave us to care for them. Some people think that animal conservation doesn't matter because the things that are needed for conservation can be used for better reasons. While captive breeding does use lots of money, time, and resources, people who don't think that animal conservation is important want to use the money, time, and resources to better human life rather than animal life. People with these views likely don't know the impacts that animals have on our lives. Think back to the scenario at the beginning of my speech, and you can see all the ways animals affect our lives without us realizing it. Many people also think that zoos mistreat animals. While this can be true in some cases, zoos today now know how important it is that animals receive the best care. In the past, animals were kept in small cages where they had nothing to do all day. Today, zoos provide animals with enclosures that mimic the natural environment of that animal. The animals have room to run around and play just like they would in the wild. An article by BYU states that one of the most common forms of mistreatment is inadequate and limited living conditions. For example, tigers and lions have about 18,000 times less space in captivity than they do in the wild, and polar bears have 1 million times less space. While this is true, the animals do have less space when they're in captivity. Their habitat in the wild is also getting smaller for many reasons, most notably global warming and deforestation. While animals are losing their place they live, they're also losing their lives. And if we do nothing about this, all animals will eventually lose their lives and become extinct. As I'm nearing the end of my speech, it is important that we look back at the main points we talked about. First, we talked about what captive breeding is and why it's important. Next, I discussed what the effects of being in captivity has on animals and how to try and limit the negativities of captivity. And last, and why it's important that zoos exist. Finally, we ended with biblical reasons why we need to care for animals. Think back to the very beginning of my speech in the world without animals. Hopefully now, when you look out the window, there are many birds flying around and tons of squirrels running around your yard. Hopefully when you look to your right, there's a dog sitting next to you just waiting for something to walk by. And when you look to your left, there's a cat curled asleep in the sunlight. Hopefully now, when you open your fridge, it's full of chicken, beef, butter, eggs, and cheese. Hopefully now you can see all the ways that animals affect your life and all the reasons why we should positively affect theirs. Now that you know about animal conservation and why it's important, go to a zoo. Go see and learn more about animals. Learn more about captive breeding. Travel and see animals in the wild. help educate others about captive breeding, and most importantly, love and care for animals. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes. Can you repeat the question? I couldn't hear you. Sorry.
You said more than once that if we do not care for animals, they will all go out, we will all go extinct and die out. I was wondering what evidence you have to support that. In light of Genesis 8:21-22, which says, "The Lord smelled the sweet aroma, and the Lord said to himself, I will never again curse the ground with a countenance for the intent to make its part of evil unto you, and I will never again destroy every living thing inside of them. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, snow and wheat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease."
Okay, so your question was, how do I have any evidence to support the when I said that animals will die out eventually?
What evidence? Not evidence.
So what evidence? Okay, well, I don't have any like concrete evidence to add that of all animals will die out eventually because of like the Bible verse you said and stuff. But you can see in the past that the rate of extinction has gone up a lot. So eventually it's just going to keep going up. So eventually there will be less and less animals. So does that kind of answer your question? Okay. Anybody else? Or Emily? Yes.
So you didn't really address this, but what would you say about, zoos captive breeding versus like puppy mills, things like that type of captive breeding? What is your thoughts? What are their thoughts on those?
Okay, so the question was, what are my views on like the difference between like zoos captive breeding, like puppy mills and stuff? Okay, so zoos, they use captive breeding for animals that are mostly going extinct and that we need to try and help, while puppy mills and stuff use breeding animals to create more pets and stuff, while there's already tons of animals like in shelters and stuff that needs homes, rather than like breeding more when there's already enough. Does that answer your question, kind of? Okay. Yes, Whit.
In reintegration of species that make captively bred, how do we modify the environment to ensure that they don't go extinct yet?
Okay, so the question was, how do we modify the environment to ensure that animals don't go extinct?
In reintegration.
Okay, so that wasn't really part of my research more, but like if we can also in the wild try to conserve animals, lands, and stuff, that also will help like with them dying in the wild and stuff. So does that answer your question? Okay. Yes.
So when an animal is in captive breeding and has grown up and was born in captive breeding, and then it's been released, how do you expect it to like thrive off of because in captive breeding they've been given food. How do you expect it to like be able to like hunt its food and like survive after it's been in humans' care for so long?
Okay, so the question was, how are animals that were born in captivity then released in the wild able to like survive? Okay, so that's also one of the points I said was that they try to release animals back to the wild as quickly as they can, so that doesn't happen. And when they're in captivity, they try to limit the things that they give them as much as they can, so that they have the ability to be able to be released without relying on humans for survival. Does that answer your question? Okay, that's all the time for questions.